Up next, I'll be talking to economist DT Cochrane. The rate of inflation has reached a record high in Canada, the highest it's been in more than 30 years. Prices are shooting up in all sectors of the economy, from food and energy to housing and transportation. And across the country, Canadian workers and households are being squeezed. A new report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives found that for almost 2/3 of people in the country, inflation has far outpaced their wage increases over the pandemic, which means effectively that there's been a pay cut for millions of workers. In corporate media, economists have tended to put the blame for inflation on low interest rates or excessive government spending, and they're using this opportunity to argue for more belt-tightening austerity. But our guest today says these explanations miss a big part of the picture. DT Cochrane is an economist and a researcher with Canadians for Tax Fairness, where he just published a report on the causes of the rise in the cost of living. DT, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So the classic explanation we hear for why inflation is going up is that there's too much money chasing too few goods. But your report points to a much simpler explanation. Can you tell us what you found?
So you have this standard explanation of too much money chasing too few goods. This is based on, frankly, bad theory that has become kind of commonplace knowledge with little understanding of where this idea comes from. We think the much simpler explanation is that those who set prices are setting prices higher. So we took a look at thousands of corporate financial results over the last 20 years to analyze profit margins, which we felt could be a good indicator for what is happening with corporate prices, the prices that corporations are responsible for, which is a lot of the prices in our economy. And what we found was a dramatic jump in profit margins in 2021. So at the same time as a lot of Canadian households are still financially struggling, corporations had one of their best years ever. So prior to the pandemic, corporate profit margins averaged about 9%. In 2021, they almost doubled to 16%. One potential explanation for this is high commodity prices. The Canadian economy, the Canadian corporate economy, is overrepresented with commodity corporations. So potentially the fact that commodity prices have been high during the pandemic is the explanation. So for our analysis, we also removed all of the commodity companies, and even among non-commodity companies, there is still a substantial jump in profit margins.
We can actually show the graph for that. And for people who are listening to the podcast or can't see the graph, this is showing, as you said, the profit margin for Canadian non-commodity companies over the last 20 or so years. And, you see this massive jump in 2021. And so explain to us how this is happening. What is contributing to this big jump here?
So the explanation for where this jump could come from is either some massive boost in productivity. There's been some incredible innovation that's allowing corporations to produce much more from the same amount of input. There is zero evidence for that. If this is not about increased productivity, this is about corporations increasing their prices. That allows them to take a larger portion of their sales as profits. There are disruptions in the global economy that are raising costs that corporations themselves face. But the real question is, who gets to pass along the increased costs that they have? And the more powerful the corporation, the more of those costs they can pass along, then not only can they pass those costs along, they can take advantage of turmoil associated with the pandemic, but also with climate disasters, also with war, to boost their own profit margins. And in corporate financial disclosures, you're actually seeing a remarkable degree of honesty where corporate executives are saying exactly this. We've been able to raise prices, and that's improving our profits.
Yeah, and just to break it down for people a little bit more, we're talking about there are reasons why costs are increasing for corporations, and if they themselves were to absorb those costs, then we would have seen their profits fall. But instead,
Absolutely.
not only are the profits not staying flat, so they're not just raising their prices a little bit in order to keep their profits what they were before. The fact that they're rising to this extent, it tells us that they're actually engaging in price gouging, right?
Yes, absolutely. So we don't think that corporations can set prices anywhere that they want, but it is pretty obvious that they are setting prices, that corporations are responsible to a large degree for our current inflationary situation. And we need to understand that much better than we currently do, much better than these banal, facile, too much money, chasing too few goods. That is an explanation that leads us nowhere, when what we actually need is greater understanding into exactly which prices are rising and why are they rising. Once we know that, then we can figure out an appropriate policy solution, not the terrible solutions that are currently being offered, increasing interest rates or cutting government spending. Both of those will harm the people who are already struggling the most. If we increase interest rates in order to curb inflation, the mechanism by which that works is unemployment.
There are even now explicit calls for, I'm specifically thinking about a Globe and Mail column I read last week, where the pundit was explicitly calling for a recession. And I want to quote, he said, if we're serious about targeting inflation, quote, tipping the economy into recession may not only be unavoidable, but desirable. Not a single word about who that would impact the most and who would be bearing the brunt of that the most, right?
It reminds me of the comment by Madeleine Albright when she was asked about all of the dead Iraqi children due to U.S. sanctions, and her saying, well, we think that it's worth it. So this Globe and Mail columnist, he's not the one who's going to be unemployed if we have a recession. Mm-hmm. It's going to be all of these other people. And we also know that people from typically marginalized communities are disproportionately last hired, first fired. So it exacerbates all kinds of social inequities. The mere suggestion that we should be using a recession to try to get inflation under control is inhumane.
Yeah. I want to play us a clip. It's becoming a regular feature of the show, playing a clip of Pierre Poilievre. But I want to play what he thinks we should do in order to address inflation, or to use his new favorite term, just inflation. Have a look at this video.
How are we going to take care of the overinflation?
We're going to stop printing money, phase out the deficit, and cut the inflationary taxes that are driving up the cost of living. So,
and that should even everything out by when?
Well, I think it'll take me about a year and a half to tackle inflation after I become Prime Minister. But they're creating a bigger and bigger mess every day, and it's going to be a lot to clean up. But basically, stop creating cash and start creating the stuff cash buys.
Stop printing money. It seems so simple. If we just had less money printed, there would be less money to go around and there'd be no inflation. No?
Yeah, I on his little portmanteau of just inflation, just from a comms perspective, it doesn't work, because it makes it sound like you're saying, oh, well, it's just inflation. Don't worry about it. That's the opposite of what he's trying to say. So that's silly just on the face of it, but that's not my area of expertise. I don't know if Poilievre believes the things that he's saying, in which case he's just a useful idiot to those who benefit from the economic status quo, or if he knows what he's saying is wrong and he's just being duplicitous. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. What he's spouting is pure nonsense. His reference to inflationary taxes is so strange, considering that one of the roles of taxes is to draw money back out of the economy, and he's saying there's too much money in the economy. Yeah. One of the things that people who make this too much money, chasing too few goods, rarely address is who they actually think it is that has this too much money. Like, who do they think should have less money? Should it be the people already trying to survive on sub-poverty social assistance? Is it the nurses who are overworked and understaffed? I will say very plainly who I think has too much money, and it's the wealthy. The wealthy have too much money that they're able to use in all kinds of socially detrimental ways. They're able to hire the tax lawyers and the accountants to help them avoid taxes. They're able to take too many flights and consume other high emission goods. They're able to buy up too many residential properties to be their assets. The spending of the wealthy has all kinds of deformatory effects on our economy. So certainly they should have much less money, but taxing them is not going to be inflationary. That's going to be a way to reduce some of the demand for some of this stuff that we should be reducing demand for.
That's the perfect segue to what I wanted to ask you about next, which is the recommendations in your report, right? So if we wanted to address the corporate greed that's driving inflation, what do we need to do? Who do we tax?
So first, I'm actually going to advocate for just greater transparency. So our report looked at publicly listed Canadian headquartered corporations. It didn't look at private Canadian corporations like, say, the Jim Pattison Group, whose eponymous owner has doubled his wealth from about $8 billion to $16 billion during the pandemic. It wasn't able to look at Canadian subsidiaries of non-Canadian corporations like Walmart. So there's a lot of companies it wasn't actually able to analyze. What we need is country by country financial reporting so that we can see where revenue is actually being generated, where profits are actually being taken, and where taxes are actually being taken. And this can be an important piece to actually figuring out what is driving inflation, as well as other gains that corporations have been making in recent years. So greater transparency is the first thing. We need to raise the general corporate income tax rate. It has been cut from almost 40% in the 80s down to 15% under Harper. Both Liberal and Conservative governments were cutting the corporate income tax rate. It has remained at 15% under Trudeau. The reasons why it was cut were supposedly increased productivity, more jobs, greater well-being. That has not come to pass. All that's happened is greater inequality and a worsened climate crisis. And we also need to increase the capital gains inclusion rate. So what does that mean? So every dollar of income that you earn for working is subject to income tax. Every dollar that you take from profitably selling an asset, only half of that is subject to income tax. That overwhelmingly benefits the ultra wealthy who own the vast majority of the assets. And when corporate profits are rising, asset values are rising along with it. So raising the corporate income tax rate, raising the capital gains inclusion rate, and increasing corporate transparency are three of the ways that Canadians for Tax Fairness recommends as part of dealing with the issue of corporations driving higher prices.
Yeah. Just to bring this to a close, I mean, some of the ideas you mentioned, the taxation ideas that you mentioned, I mean, they're overwhelmingly popular with Canadians. There was a poll last year done by Abacus, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and it found basically super majority support for taxing the rich. You know, close to 90% of the people in the poll said they support a wealth tax. Similar numbers support increasing the income tax rate. Others supported the excessive corporate profit tax. And what was also interesting is that support for these ideas cut across regional, demographic, and even partisan divides. So there's no political party that has a clear advantage on this issue. Now, we know the right historically has been really good at stoking people's fears and anxieties about the cost of living going up. But I'm wondering what you think it takes for the left to also be able to channel those fears and anxieties into political support for the kinds of programs and policies it would take to go after the culprits that you describe behind inflation.
Yeah, I see that the widespread recognition of corporate power. Everywhere you turn, you find corporate power affecting our lives in harmful ways, causing us harm. Yet somehow the prevailing narrative of supply and demand setting prices through the market at an equilibrium that clears the market has taken hold. And I think the reason it's taken hold is because it's so useful to the corporations who have actual price setting power. So we need to tap into people's recognition that corporations are powerful, their anger about that power, and connect it very simply to the fact that corporations set a large majority of the prices that people face in their day-to-day lives. The story is so much simpler than the dominant narrative. Mm-hmm. You have corporations who sell us many of the goods that we need. They get to set the prices on that. Let's start from there when we're wanting to understand where inflation is coming from.
They're price makers, not price takers, like you wrote.
Corporations are price makers. They're not price takers. Mm-hmm. But then let's connect that to the fact that corporations have broad control within our economy. Yeah. Capitalism has often been juxtaposed against command economies, and we were told that the collapse of the Soviet Union showed the failure of command economies. But we have a command economy. Mm-hmm. It's just commanded by the executives in the C-suites. And it's commanded in the interest of themselves and the wealthy owners of the corporations. So we need to juxtapose our existing corporate command economy with a publicly managed economy, and then talk about the economy we actually want to see. Offer, again, a clear vision for what we think a sustainable, just, caring economy can and should be.
Mm. Well, we'll leave it there. DT, thanks so much for joining us today. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.